Hey folks, last year we did a video about how Harlan County got its title Bloody Harlan because of the violence between mine operators and striking miners in what became known as the Harlan County War. Well, we're going to revisit Bloody Harlan. This time we're going to tell you about the bootleggers and moonshiners of Bloody Harlan. At least a few stories about them. Now, there's no way we could tell you all the stories of the moonshining and bootlegging that went on in the hills of Harlan County. So we picked a few that we like and that we thought was interesting, and also a couple of them that we knew personally were true. So we hope you enjoy us taking you on a little trip back in time to when moonshining and bootlegging was big business in Harlan County. We're going to tell you about a world famous bootlegger from right here in Harlan County. We're going to talk to you about a moon runner on a date with the girl of his dreams and a trunk load of moonshine whiskey. We're going to tell you about a lady down on her luck forced to make and sell homebrew to support her family. We'll tell you the story of a moonshiner who kept his still a secret from the law and his wife. That's right. We're going to tell you about a northern boy that came to Harlan County and thought he could handle moonshine whiskey. Oh yeah, and we're going to tell you about some red high heels and drunk chickens. You'll just have to wait and see. In this video, we're going to tell you the story of some of these folks who did this and talk about why they felt they had no choice. We're going to talk to you about hard times and hard choices, bootleg whiskey and moonshine stills. Yeah, and like I said, drunk chickens and red high heels. Guys, if you're going to talk about moonshining and bootlegging, you need to explain the difference in them. And there is a difference. A moonshiner is someone who produces corn liquor by distilling a concoction called corn mash in a moonshine still into a clear, potent, drinkable form of alcohol. Well, some people might say it's not all that drinkable. But anyway, the moonshiner becomes a bootlegger when he transports his liquor from the location it's produced or when he sells his liquor. If a person other than the moonshiner transports and sells the liquor, then that person is a bootlegger but not a moonshiner unless he produces corn liquor himself. Bootlegging is the act of illegally transporting and selling alcoholic beverages, be it moonshine whiskey, store-bought whiskey, beer, or a homemade concoction called homebrew. No one can talk about the illegal liquor trade in Harlan County without talking about the queen of the mountain bootleggers, Mag Bailey. Mag Bailey, who was a long-time resident of Harlan County in Clovertown, ran her liquor business out of her home, starting when she was only 17 and continuing into her 90s. In all those years, she was only convicted once in the 1940s. She served less than 2 years in federal prison, and after that, she was never convicted again. Folks say the reason for that is it would have been near impossible to get a jury in Harlan County to convict her. She dressed and looked like your grandmother, gray hair, apron and all, and she done a lot of good for the folks in Harlan. She bought food for families in need, helped coal miners when they were out of work, and she even sent some kids to college. People often said there's no point in giving Mag any trouble for what she does because if she didn't do it, somebody else would. And she was careful about who she sold to. She avoided selling to minors, underage kids, and what she called drunkards. If you had a reputation for laying out drunk, Mag's was the wrong place to try to buy liquor. She sold moonshine into the 1950s and switched over to selling packaged liquor and beer brought outside of Harlan County and transported in the 1960s. She continued this until she retired in her 90s. I hear she became a churchgoer after that. She passed away in December 2005 at the age of 101 years old, at peace with the law and God. Harlan County had other well-known bootleggers, including women. And I understand Bell County had a famous female bootlegger, but none become as famous as Mag Bailey, the queen of the mountain bootleggers. If you're going to talk about the moonshine business in Harlan County, you've got to talk about the Moonshine Highway, the road between Knoxville, Tennessee and Harlan, Kentucky. Actor Robert Mitchum called the highway Thunder Road in the 1958 movie by the same name. Mitchum wrote and produced the movie himself that tells the story of fictitious Harlan County moonshiner Luke Doolin, who ultimately meets his demise on the Moonshine Highway between Harlan and Knoxville. Harlan Moonrunners moved their product down this highway to sell it in Knoxville and points beyond, like North Carolina. These moonrunners would have to run a gauntlet of federal agents, state police, highway patrol, county sheriffs, and local police departments before they could deliver their goods. It wasn't unusual for some of these boys to buy a load of store-bought liquor while they were out of town and bring it back into Harlan to be sold by bootleggers. So occasionally some of the braver ones would run liquor both ways, in and out of Harlan. It was these reckless, fearless, and sometimes just plumb crazy moonrunners from all over the South that helped to give birth to NASCAR. Now, one of my favorite stories about a Harlan County moonrunner I heard from a couple of family members growing up. Now, I can't vouch for how true this story is, but if it's not true, it should be. It was always one of my favorite stories. It seems there was this young man who run liquor out of Harlan into Tennessee. He had a respectable day job, but at the night time he ran the liquor down Thunder Road. Well, there's this girl from a somewhat well-to-do family in Harlan that he had his eye on for a long time. He finally convinced her to go out with him, and her daddy agreed to it because, like I said, he had a pretty good day job. Only on one condition: they could go to a movie, but not a drive-in movie. Her daddy is having no part of his girl going to a drive-in movie with the boy, so they went to a theater on a Saturday night. Well, this happened to be a Saturday night. He was about to make a run to Knoxville. So he went ahead and loaded his car with moonshine whiskey before the date so he wouldn't have to go back and load it afterwards. Now, you couldn't tell these cars had a load of moonshine whiskey in them because they had heavy suspension until they actually rode a little bit high, empty. That's how sometimes the law knew a car was used for running moon. If they seen it and it was setting high, they knew it had heavy suspension in the back. So once loaded with moonshine, it set normal and you couldn't tell there was anything in it. At any rate, they had a good time at the movie, and on the way back home, the boy noticed down the road he was traveling 2 cars, one on each side of the road. Now, he didn't get close enough to tell if there was law, but he wasn't going to take any chances. He U-turned and headed the other direction without the cars noticing. When the girl asked why he did it, he said, "That might be the cops down there." She said, "Well, what's wrong with that?" He said, "Honey," he said, "I got a load of moonshine whiskey in the back of this car." He said, I'm not fooling with no cops tonight. Well, they continued home the long way. Didn't say much. When they finally pulled up in front of her house, he looked over at her and said, "I guess you won't be wanting to fool with me anymore now that you know what I do." She said, "Are you kidding?" Said, "Next Saturday, I'm going to tell my daddy that I'm staying all night with a girlfriend so I can make the run to Knoxville with you." The way I heard the story, they got married and had kids and become a respectable family in Harlan. Like I said, if that story ain't true, it should be. Anyway, it's one of my longtime favorites from when I was a kid. These drivers would have no moonshine to transport out of Harlan if it wasn't for men like a gentleman we'll call Lonnie. Lonnie was a coal miner, coal truck driver, and a Harlan County moonshiner. His story is related to us by his son, a man who appears in one of our videos himself, telling us about his 30 years in the Harlan County coal mines. He also told us the story of his father's corn liquor, which we relate to you here. Unlike many mountain moonshiners, he preferred rainwater to mountain water. He thought it made his liquor smoother, and his son tells us it did. He'd set up a system to catch rainwater in barrels at his moonshine still, so after a hard rain, he could run a batch of liquor. Of course, this reduced the amount of liquor he could run, but what he lacked in quantity, he made up for in quality. Those who knew his liquor prized it and would pay top dollar for it. His sons had promised their father they would never willingly consume any liquor, their father's or anyone else's. You might recognize this picture. I've used it in previous video. It's an actual picture of 2 of his sons and a jug of his moonshine. So, as not to break their promise of not willingly drinking liquor, you'll notice in this picture, they're taking turns holding a weapon on each other So if they got caught, they could say they didn't do it willingly. Anyway, I love that picture. His wife never approved of him making illegal liquor. So to avoid her wrath, and we all know how much we want to avoid our wife's wrath. So to avoid her wrath, he kept his moonshine still a secret from her, usually telling her he was going squirrel hunting when he went to the still. All he had to do was shoot some squirrels and take them home, and she never knew any different. One time their chickens found his corn mash and ate it. When his wife noticed their chickens falling all over the yard, she at first thought they had gotten into something poisonous and was dying. She soon realized it was corn mash they'd gotten into, and they were simply drunk. Chickens had a good time, folks. I wonder if it was Saturday, but At which point she grabbed the chopping axe and went looking for the still. She never found it, and he was finally able to convince her the chickens must have gotten into someone else's corn mash. The law never found him out, but out of fear that his wife would, he finally gave up moonshining. His son tells us it was the finest liquor he ever tasted, and other folks must have agreed because he had people beg him to run one more batch till his dying day. Now, another story about Lonnie's moonshine whiskey. There's this young Harlan boy in the military who met a boy from up north and become good friends with him. He brought him home to Harlan County on leave one time. Now, it happens this boy's father had a jug of Lonnie's moonshine whiskey in the house. Now, this northern boy got to bragging about how he heard tales of Harlan County moonshine and how powerful it was and how potent it was and what a kick it had. And he didn't think much of that. He had drunk just about everything with alcohol in it, and he could handle anything. Well, at this point, the man of the house went to his cabinet and retrieved the jug of Lonnie's moonshine whiskey. Set it on a table in front of the boy. Now, this jug was about half full, and said, "Son, have at it." Well, the boy turned it up and really lit into it. I mean, he drank quite a bit of it. Set it down, started sweating, his face turned red, and finally he just slipped out of the chair he was sitting in and landed under the table. And he stayed there for almost 2 days. The lady of the house put a pillow under his head and covered him up with a blanket. When he finally came to, he complained of having a headache and asked if there was another jug of that he could take back north with him. A good friend of mine tells me the story of his mother, another lady who was forced into bootlegging by economic hardship. Nowhere near the size of Mike Bailey's operation, but enough to keep her children from starving. His mother, her 4 sisters, and their mother had been abandoned by their father in the middle of the Great Depression. She had little change for education because of this and was no stranger to starvation. So when her husband abandoned her and her 4 children in the early 1960s, she knew all too well how hard it could get for a woman with no education trying to raise 4 children by herself. With her immediate family being as poor as her, she had nowhere to turn for help except her own 2 hands. She went to work cleaning houses for anyone who would hire her, but this fell short of supporting her children. Out of desperation, she contacted social services, which most folks just called the welfare back then. A caseworker was dispatched out to her house to see if there was any way they could help her. The worker was a well-dressed young lady who was wearing a shiny pair of red high heels. After carefully reviewing his mom's situation, sitting on the front porch with her, the young lady announced to his mother the best thing for her to do would be to give her children up and put them in what was called back then a welfare home. At this point in time, his mom announced to the young lady what a beautiful pair of red high heels she had on. The young lady answered and said, "Thank you, I just got them." His mom then said, "Can you run in them?" The young lady said, "Not really, they're high heels after all." At which point my friend's mother said, "You better start learning real fast, because if I get my hands on you before you get out of here, I'm going to beat the snot out of you and throw you off this porch." The lady took off across the porch, making good time in her high heels. She managed to get them off, going down the steps, and hit the gravels barefoot. He said he had never seen anyone run that fast barefoot across gravels before or since. She jumped into her car and took off, leaving a share of gravel and dust. At this point, my friend said his mom felt like she had nothing to turn to but one of the few things of any value her father had left her when he abandoned his family in the middle of the Great Depression. A recipe for a simple and potent concoction called homebrew. Homebrew is a generic name for anything alcoholic that is made at home. In this case, it was a simple recipe with only 4 ingredients, 2 of which were malt syrup and yeast. When combined with the other 2 ingredients, it created a crude and extremely potent malt beverage. Lacking the financial ability and transportation to go outside of Harlan County and buy liquor and transport it back in, or put up an actual moonshine still, which he said his mom knew how to do. She just couldn't afford to put one up. She turned to the simplest and cheapest method she knew to feed her family, making and selling homebrew. He said he could still remember watching his mom and older brother mix the concoction in 5-gallon metal cans, which was either cleaned out lard cans or new shiny cans supplied by his mom's business partner, who we'll talk about in a minute. Once mixed, the cans 4 or 6 at a time would be placed behind the wood-burning kitchen stove to work off. Now the lids could never be pressed down tightly on the cans, but had to be laid loosely on top because of the pressure created by the working process. But occasionally one would accidentally get pressed down, and my friend says he can still remember being woke up late in the night by the sound of one of those lids being blown off the top of the can, hitting the ceiling, and then landing on the floor. He said the house was always filled with what he thought was a wonderful malt smell during the process. But of course his mom worried about the wrong person showing up at the wrong time and noticing the smell, which fortunately never happened. When finished, it created a very dark beverage reminiscent of a dark beer with a very thick foam on top. He said it looked very tasty to him, especially with the foamy head on top. But his mom said he would get the whooping to end all whoopings if he ever got in it. And from past experience, he knew his mom wasn't bluffing. He said he did finally slip a taste of it and found out it was a bitter, nasty tasting brew indeed. Nothing he would ever want to risk his mother's wrath for again. His mom herself hated the concoction and said it was only good for getting real drunk real fast and waking up with a bad headache. She sold her brew with the help of her business partner I mentioned earlier, a gentleman who had made connections needed to sell the homebrew through his day job. His mom and older brother would strain the homebrew through clean cloth and pour it into quart mason jars and gallon glass jugs, both provided by his mom's partner. Then the gentleman would pick it up after dark and take it and sell it to folks in Harlan County who, believe it or not, really enjoyed it and didn't care to pay for it. It was cheaper than store-bought liquor at the Bootleggers and way cheaper than moonshine whiskey, so there was always a good customer base for it. She was never proud of it, but she was never ashamed of it either. She said she done it to feed her family because their father wouldn't. Eventually, she was able to give up bootlegging and see her children educated and independent. My friend says, believe it or not, one of his fondest childhood memories is the smell of that homebrew filling the house and the occasional sound of one of those lids blowing off the top of a can in the middle of the night. I want to thank my friend, who will remain nameless, for sharing the story of his mother with me and allowing me to share it with you. She was a grand lady. I knew her myself, and we all miss her. Folks, we hope you've enjoyed our little story about how Harlan County stayed wet through a long dry spell. From the biggest to the smallest, some drunk chickens and a pair of red high heels. That's just a few of the many stories of bootlegging and moonshining in the hills of Harlan, Kentucky. And folks, if you have any of these stories, please put them in the comment section down below, please. And from your stories of your family members or legends you heard. We certainly appreciate you sticking with us and listening to our stories. Thank you so much.
Bye. Y'all Y'all come back now.